Today in the show, I'm chatting with the co-author of Disneyland on the Mountain, Kathryn Mayer. Kathryn's book shares a lot of information about Disney's Mineral King ski resort. To some of you, that might sound familiar. To others, you may not have ever heard of it. In either case, you're going to learn a ton today. Mineral King Ski Resort was a dream project of Walt Disney's, taking place between the creations of Disneyland and Walt Disney World. Walt wanted to reinvent the way the public enjoyed a ski resort. Like so many other dreams of Walt's, his visions were ahead of his time. This project never came to be due to many battles between the Walt Disney Company and environmentalists. If you were like me, you might have thought this dream project went away after Walt's passing in 1966, but the battle went on. Probably for longer than you'd ever think. Enjoy today's conversation about the unrealized Mineral King ski resort.
It's time to dive into today's Disney dialogue.
Hello, Kathryn, and welcome to Disney Coast to Coast.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you today about a subject matter that I think Disney fans, or at least like the diehard Disney fans, have heard of. I don't know necessarily how much they know about it, but also, casual Disney fans may have never heard of the Mineral King ski resort. So to start things off, can you just kind of give us an overview of what the Mineral King ski resort project was, what the project was and what the ultimate result was supposed to be?
Absolutely. And what you just said, that some people know a little bit about it and then some others don't know anything about it. And I was kind of in that first group who knew a little bit about it, then came to find out quite a bit and realized, wow, this is such an interesting story. This should be a book. I can't believe it's not a book. And that's kind of how I got into it. But the Mineral King Ski Resort was one of Walt Disney's big projects in the 1960s and into the 1970s. Obviously, Walt had passed away in the mid-60s, but the Disney Company had carried on after Walt's death. But this was something that Walt himself really wanted to build. This was actually the second experiential project that the Disney Company was trying to build. This was after Disneyland, not long after. He basically started thinking about this in 1960. And it was formally announced in 1965. And this was really something that he was so excited about. Walt was a skier, but he also really cared about nature and conservation. So he basically thought to himself, hey, I want to create something like this. It's not going to be like Disneyland. The title, it's pretty tongue-in-cheek because that was a fear of the people who didn't want this to happen. But he really wanted to have this awesome area. He wanted people to have access to it. So this was going to be in a place called Mineral King, California, which was kind of in between Anaheim and San Francisco. And he was basically envisioning it as a ski resort, yes, but also as an all year round recreation destination. Families could go there, non-skiers could go there. And it was smack in the middle of Disneyland and the Florida project. And he basically the Disney Company tried to make this happen for over a decade, believe it or not. I think a lot of people would have no idea that this saga lasted that long. And eventually it basically fell apart because of a lot of different controversies that happened because of it.
Yeah, that was the thing that surprised me most when reading about this was how long they had truly been working on it and far beyond Walt's death. Like, I kind of had the mindset that, like, when Walt passed away, it was just one of the things that kind of, fell away. And that is not the case at all. They fought for a long time. We're going to be getting into it. The name of your book is Disneyland on the Mountain, Walt, the Environmentalists, and the Ski Resort That Never Was. And I'm going to read a little piece of it in the book right now. You have this description. It said, Walt explained his vision for a bustling vacation destination where, after a long day of skiing, guests could go ice skating, dog sledding, or tobogganing, watch the latest Disney film, or unwind in one of several restaurants. In the summer, visitors could fish, camp, hike, study wildlife, go on a picnic, or take a sightseeing tour on a ski lift. And he very much envisioned this as a place where Olympic skiers could train at Mineral King. It's quite a vision for sure. And it might sound I don't know, I'm not a skier, so this may be an incorrect statement, but might sound a little basic today, like, oh, a ski resort for the whole family. But like back then, that really was not a thing.
Yes, that's exactly right. Walt, as usual, was ahead of his time because he was like, I'm going to create something like this. It's going to be much more than skiing. We're going to have shopping. We're going to have cool restaurants. We're going to have all kinds of things that you could do outdoors, but indoors as well. But no one was thinking about that at that time. That's the crazy part. Ski resorts of the time were very rudimentary. They were essentially people would drive up for the day. They would go skiing. They were very athletic to even like get to that point, by the way. And then they would essentially leave a day later. And that was pretty much it. They would maybe go to a beer hall that was attached to the lodge and get a drink or something after, having their runs. And that was pretty much the whole thing. So Walt was really trying to turn this whole sport on its head. At the time, too, what was interesting was there was a couple different government reports that came out saying the average American was going to be working only a handful of hours, essentially a week.
It was like 15 hours a week.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't we all wish that actually happened? But obviously that did not happen. But so they were also counting on a lot of people were going to have a lot more time. And they were also going to have more disposable income, of course, as well, to have these vacations and to actually spend time, have a few days there, not just go up for the day and come back. So
wait a second, 15 hours a week in disposable income? Where is this future?
I know that's the next book, I think, is what happened, because what a disappointment that turned out to be.
Truly. And of course, Walt, got inspiration from various places and situations. And one of them is that Walt became friends with Austrian skiing champion Hans Schroll.
Yeah, so there's a few different things that were so interesting. So Walt was in fact a skier. He always said he wasn't very good at it, but he was friends with Hans Schroll, who famously actually was he yodeled when he would ski, and that actually became the famous goofy yell and yodel that was found later. So that was very funny. But Schroll helped him learn to ski, which was really interesting. And Walt later became an investor at something called Sugar Bowl in California. And so he always really had his hand in skiing from as early as I think it was the 1930s or so. And then he actually also had this big role later on at the 1960 Winter Olympics, where everything kind of turned on its head. And this idea really kickstarted for Walt because he was chairman of pageantry. So he was essentially had this role as reinventing the opening ceremonies, the closing ceremonies, and all the entertainment at the games. And again, like we just said, how ski resorts, that's what we think of ski resorts now is, they're family friendly. People go up there, even if they're non-skiers, and it's just fun time. Kind of like we think of the Olympics, big spectacles and stuff like that. That was not the case at the time. Walt basically created that. And so at those 1960 Winter Olympics, he also became really excited about this idea. And then he met another famous skier named Willie Schaeffler. And the two basically tried to create this thing.
Very nice. And as you mentioned, Walt was a nature lover for sure. And he wanted as little human footprint as possible to take place. Obviously, there were going to be man-made things, but it wasn't going to be like, oh, we built Sleeping Beauty Castle on this mountain. No,
exactly.
No cars were going to be allowed. So they had to park at the edge of the valley, and they had multiple different plans of how people would get up there, but a train was one of them, very on brand for Walt. But
absolutely.
As I was reading all of these ideas and concepts going into this project, it was so interesting to me because so much of it we kind of end up seeing in other places. So this whole no parking at this ski resort, is very Magic Kingdom these days, right? We cannot park at Magic Kingdom. You need to park at a separate parking lot and take a monorail or a boat over. So these elements and these concepts still live on, even though this project never came to reality.
Yeah, exactly. And it was so interesting not knowing that part about it, obviously, until we're deep into the research project and finding out all these interesting things that did kind of make its way into other Disney parks and themes and things like that. Of course, I grew up with Disney. I am a Disney person, and going to the parks and everything. So all those little things were like, wait, that actually came from Mineral King. It's so interesting that was the case. And like you said, the railroads, that was one of the things at first. Walt was all excited that he was going to put this basically romantic train ride into the valley at some point. And of course, we, people who know Disney know that Walt is obsessed with trains. And at one point, they even thought about a monorail. And at another point, there's a lot of transportation that was happening, by the way, at this Mineral Kid Resort.
Once again, on brand, though. How many ways are there to get to Magic Kingdom?
Exactly. And there was even the talk of the People Mover at one point that was actually going to be all around this Mineral King ski resort, because people could not drive into it because there was going to be no cars allowed. So there's going to be some different kinds of, parking lots and things like that. And then they could take the train basically into the real resort. And then all throughout the resort, there was essentially going to be what is now the People Mover, but it was going to be not just an attraction. It was really going to be just a very logical way of saying, hey, here you can get to this run, you can get to this resort. And especially in a smaller area like that, it seems to make a lot of sense.
Yeah. And going with that theme of, letting the nature live, he was going to make the ski lifts camouflaged so that they wouldn't stand out among the trees. The village would be situated so it would not be seen from the valley entrance, and service areas would be hidden underground. What a novel idea. Once again,
that doesn't sound familiar at all to any Disney people, right?
Yeah. Now, a quote from Walt Disney, who said it was going to be, quote, a year-round recreational facility for everyone, regardless of age, income, leisure time interests, or athletic abilities. There was the necessity to preserve the great natural beauty of the site. That is a must, said Walt Disney. And this is kind of fascinating to hear all that, because as we're going to get into, this was an uphill battle, no pun intended, up mountain battle, I guess, as far as the amount of protesting and just like naturists who really didn't want Disney. They did not want Disneyland on the mountain, the name of your book, right?
Yeah, there was so much controversy over this, and it really blew up for them. And I think that in some ways they were not prepared for this at all. I don't think that when they started thinking about this, they thought that this was going to be controversial really at all. So what was interesting was that even before there was any kind of a whiff of controversy over this, Walt was saying, we want to keep this really pristine. This is not Disneyland. This is something totally different, because I love this area. I love nature. This is one of the prettiest places I've ever seen. I'm going to keep it this way. And everything that he was doing was showing people that he was very serious about this. So this was not lip talk. I mean, this was not lip service. He really, really meant it. And the interesting thing is that we go into in the book quite a bit was talking about Walt as this conservationist and this environmentalist. He actually, weirdly enough, he was lauded by a number of environmental groups, including the Sierra Club, which was the group that later sued his project and fought him over this ski resort. He actually won a lifetime achievement award with them, a lifetime membership, won a ton of other different awards, all because of the things that he had done for the environment even before this. So that was really interesting, obviously. And a big reason why he was lauded by so many people was because of his True Life Adventure series that he started in the late 1940s and went all the way, I think, to 1960. And so he basically created these films all with the intention of showing people these beautiful areas, showing the environment around us, all over the world. Here are the animals that live here. Here's how to, here's how they live. Here's how to treat things respectfully. And actually, a lot of the people that became environmentalists, especially in the 1960s, 1970s, they grew up with these films. And so actually became environmentalists in part because of Walt Disney. So there's a lot of really interesting nuances of this story that I had no idea about, of course, up until when we started writing this.
Yeah, I mean, Walt pictured this as a recreation project, not an entertainment center. He said there would be no Hollywood flourishes, and the name Disney wouldn't even be part of it. So it is interesting because I guess the people who were fighting him were like, oh, what a hypocrite, right? He says all these things. But the reality is he wasn't just saying stuff. He was doing stuff for decades in service of, the environment and nature. So it is such a weird battle. I want to read from your book why Mineral King was the best option, because of course they did their due diligence. They did a lot of research, and they fell on Mineral King because Mineral King was by far the best available site for the project Walt had in mind. This is a quote from BuzzPrice. It had maximum market exposure, summer and winter, and it had the physical attributes he was seeking: 3 huge bowls, 5-mile runs, and a 5,000-foot drop. It had the required scale and scope for the creation of a resort with a draw strong enough to generate positive economic feasibility. So that's the reason they kind of fell on this particular land. But, as we said, not everybody was happy about this. The Sierra Club, this was the main group fighting him. Can you talk to me a little bit about who the Sierra Club is and was?
Yeah, absolutely. So they were one of the biggest environmental groups at the time, and they still are to this day, which is interesting. And so the Sierra Club, they were founded in the late 1800s, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, by John Muir, a famous conservationist. And at first, the group was really about, let's all go see some beautiful areas. Essentially, a lot of at the beginning, a lot of the groups throughout the country basically went to national parks, things like that. John Muir actually famously created a lot of different national parks in America. And so they would go to some of these areas, they would go hiking and they would go fishing and just really kind of explore. And then starting in the 1960s, times were changing in America. And so they basically became a lot more vocal. And actually, the group itself actually had a lot of different controversy within the group, because some of them really just liked, again, let's showcase some of nature. Let's go enjoy it. Let's be that group. And then some of them wanted to get more involved and kind of have political battles and things like that, and including things like this Disney resort, where they started to say, hey, let's fight against some of this. Let's be more vocal about it. Let's say that we shouldn't develop a lot of areas, things like that. And a lot of that was because of where we were in that moment in time in America, because this was this rising environmental movement that we were seeing. And so a lot of people were growing concerned about things like pollution and is our air clean? Is our water clean? What are they putting on our food? And it also became a lot about, what about these open spaces? Is everything going to be developed? And that was a big concern that we were seeing. And this Mineral King resort was really ripe for that controversy, because the Mineral King in California, actually a lot of Sierra Club members loved that area. That was actually like one of the places that they would go to quite a bit. A lot of who later became essentially executives at the Sierra Club, they would go there, and that would be kind of their area of solitude. So when they found out, oh my gosh, this may be getting developed and Disney's name is being thrown out, oh my gosh, people were starting to get up in arms about that. And Disney wasn't the controversial. I think that if, when you say Disney now, some people kind of roll their eyes. There's that Disneyfication of things. And that's obviously not what it really was back then. but I think it was starting a little bit. So people certainly didn't want that, the company synonymous with Mickey Mouse and Disneyland, and then suddenly they're going to be here and ruining our area, sort of in their mindset at least.
What would have been interesting to see if this had actually come to fruition is, like how when Epcot was created, it was the park with no Disney characters. It was more about education and stuff. It'd be interesting to see if, this ski resort had been built with Walt's intention of, listen, the Disney name isn't going to be on it. The Disneyfication isn't going to be there. Be interesting if eventually it was like, no, we do want Mickey there, and what would have happened. And then, of course, that would have been even more upsetting for the Sierra Club.
100%. I think that any of us with that familiarity of Disney and kind of what they do would expect Mickey would have made his way into the park. Or not the park, literally the park, I guess you could say. But
yeah.
But seeing those characters and things like that, and they famously also a couple years into the planning, after saying we're not going to have entertainment, we're not going to have things like that, then they started to create some kind of entertainment.
Yeah, we'll get to that because that is some fun stuff.
But yeah, it would have been interesting to see kind of how things would have changed for sure.
It's interesting to hear you say how like the Sierra Club members were also kind of all had different opinions, because there was a club member quoted as saying, to sue Disney would be like suing motherhood, the flag, and the Boy Scouts all at once, because they did eventually sue Disney. They figured out, I'm not exactly sure how this happened, but once again, reminiscent of Walt Disney World, they were buying this land under fake names.
Yeah.
And that's how they were getting the land for this project. And I believe somebody in the Sierra Club figured this out and ultimately sued Disney. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, which is insane to think about. And this was over years and years.
Yes, it is. And that was one of the things that I had no idea that happened from my limited knowledge about, Disney once tried to create a ski resort. That was like a lot of us, that was limited knowledge, having no concept that this actually went to the Supreme Court. And of course, that this was so controversial. I will know one thing that is kind of important to the story is that Disney was involved in the suit, in the sense where they were suing Disney's project, but the Sierra Club actually chose to sue the government and not Disney, because they were so worried about those optics. Because of the quote you just said, people did love Disney the way a lot of people still love Disney. So they were really scared to sue Disney. So they technically sued the government, because the government was the entity that essentially said, hey, we actually want to have some more land open up for things like skiing. Does anyone want to develop it? And so this area was actually open for bid. So it wasn't just Walt Disney who said specifically, hey, I want to build right here. So it is important to note that in the controversy too.
Yeah, there are a couple, you made some really great points. I do want to mention, though, you mentioned like the love that people had for Disney, which is still very much true today, right? Like there are people podcasting about it, but one of and writing books about it. But one of the things that I think is a big differentiator is, for us, our entire lives, Disney has been a brand. Right. I mean, yeah, for us, we love Walt, but we weren't there seeing Walt every week on TV and such. And these were people that, when you said Disney, I think it was people who thought more Uncle Walt versus the Walt Disney Company. Mm-hmm. And that's definitely far lesser today. So it was even more personal probably when it was like, let's sue Disney. It's like, no. You're not going to sue Walt Disney, not the Walt Disney Company.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I think you're totally right. So this reminds me, one person that we had spoke to when we were writing this, obviously we were able to talk to a number of people who were involved, which was a feat on its own, because this of course happened many, many years ago. But I remember us talking to someone who was a kid in the Mineral King area. And so a lot of people in that area were, oh my gosh, some of them were, we don't want someone to build over here. But then when they found out it was Disney, she was a kid at the time, and she told us that Walt actually had come into that area in 1965 when to hand deliver the bid, saying, I want to have this. And then of course, Disney was chosen to build it. And when Walt came in, people were holding streamers and signs, and they put signs all up on the roads saying like, "Welcome, Walt." And people were so excited to see him. Do you have that level of love for him? And those people who were there at the time, even the ones who were a little bit concerned, a lot of them were so excited to see him.
Yeah, that's so cool. You mentioned the state wanted something developed there, and I believe that's where the prospectus for a proposed recreational development at Mineral King and Sequoia National Forest comes from, correct? This was something put out by the state?
Yeah, they were pretty excited about this. Obviously, this is California. They were trying to think of, okay, are we going to have some kind of different recreation projects and things opened up? Skiing was becoming pretty popular at that time. And obviously for the state, this was going to pour millions, then billions probably into the economy. So of course they were pretty excited about this happening. And this was in an area too that they thought was kind of a slam dunk because this was basically in the middle of Mineral King area, basically in the middle of Anaheim and San Francisco. So they figured, okay, people are going to be driving, from those two big metropolitan areas. Let's basically put something in between them. I'm sorry. And I said Anaheim. I also meant the LA area too. So LA/Anaheim and then San Francisco. But so they were really excited about having that in that area because they thought they were going to get a lot of traffic and a lot of visitors.
And so several people kind of bid for this, and the final two were Dizney and Brandt. Who was Brandt again?
Robert Brandt was a stockbroker, and he had done some stuff with real estate. And the funny thing about Robert Brandt, which people could read about in the book, but he was actually married to Janet Leigh, the famous Hollywood actress. She was in Psycho. Everyone remembers the shower scene. That was her. And so she was actually going to be super involved in that project. So that same day when the bids were delivered, it was Walt Disney and it was Janet Leigh. And they were just showing up to this place in California. And people were like, oh my God, like what is happening?
And the funny thing was like Walt was kind of paranoid about his plans getting out about this because like the bid was pretty fierce. The Disney company eventually won, but like he was paranoid to the point that they thought there were listening devices in the hotel rooms and tapped phones and microphones and such, right?
Yeah, that's true. That was another person that we had interviewed for the book. Actually, he lives in Colorado as well, and that's where I live. And he had done PR, and he had a big role in this Mineral King project. He was one of the project organizers essentially, and he said that when he went there with another Disney person, Bob Hicks, they basically went all throughout their rooms and looked for bugs and wires to make sure that no one was listening to what they were planning. They didn't want that information to get out. So it was really, really interesting.
It's wild. Now, Buzz Price is a name I quoted earlier. If you don't know Buzz Price, well, if you're a diehard Disney fan, you've heard this name. This is the man who found the land for Disneyland as well as Walt Disney World. He was kind of the data man for Disney.
Yeah.
And he did the same sort of work for Mineral King. He looked into population, tourism growth, national forest and park use, winter sports trends, the required facilities that they would need to build something like this. Basically, they did their homework. This was a big, massive, I mean, as much, if not more than for Disneyland, it sounded like.
Yeah, they certainly did. They certainly did their homework. And the funny thing is that Walt had gone to Mineral King even before this all had happened, before this land opened up. And Bob Hicks, who I mentioned, another Disney guy who was heavily involved in this project and essentially took it over for a while, he also had been familiar with Mineral King as well. And so Bob Hicks had worked with Buzz Price. And so a lot of people actually liked Mineral King even before they knew that it was going to be opened up. And so it just seemed perfect at that moment in time. But yeah, they certainly did their due diligence as you would expect Disney to do. They looked at all kinds of things, including snowfall and, thinking about how much money was going to be spent there, how many people were going to fly in versus drive in. Because at that time, commercial airlines, people weren't even flying, obviously, the way that we do today. And yeah, they thought this was the place. And they certainly poured a lot of data and research into that decision.
Yeah, and they visited the Swiss skiing village of Zermatt for inspiration, correct?
Yes, that is true. And Zermatt, when you had mentioned the no cars, that was actually what happened at Zermatt. So Walt himself loved that area, and he had spent some time there because they actually filmed one of their live action movies, Third Man on the Mountain, I think in the 1960s. And he basically fell in love with that area. And so he really wanted to model some of that from in the Mineral King area as well. And famously, that's where the Matterhorn is as well, the real life Matterhorn. And when he was there in Switzerland filming, he actually famously wrote on a postcard, and it had the Matterhorn on it. And then he said, "Build this." And he sent it back to some of the Disney Imagineers. And then, of course, we see the Matterhorn bobsleds.
And they built it.
And they did.
It's gotta be nice to have that sort of power and money, right?
Yeah, right.
Postcard of the Matterhorn, turn it around, right? Build it, send it off, and then it happens. Unbelievable. That's amazing. Now, I know you mentioned this already, but it's important to reiterate, I think, that this project, this development, was between the creation of Disneyland and the creation of Walt Disney World. So Disneyland had been open for a while at this point, and Walt Disney World not open yet. And that's important to remember, because one of the things that I found fascinating is that this was Disney's first foray into building and managing its own hotels. So at that time, only Disneyland Resort existed, or Disneyland Park really, and the Disneyland Hotel was owned by Jack Rather still at that point. Disney hadn't purchased it from them until the 80s. So, their first foray into building and managing its own hotels. It's crazy to think that there was a time when Disney wasn't doing that already.
I know, absolutely. It was so interesting. Again, it was smack in the middle of this Disneyland and the Florida project planning. And there was a ton of different firsts for this and so when we talk about, so many things when we were doing the research for this book and seeing some of the things that kind of cropped up, my head immediately went to, this sounds exactly like Disney World rather. And it was actually for Mineral King. So that was really, really surprising. And one of that was what you just mentioned, which was the hotels. So when you just mentioned about Buzz Price, for instance, putting together these very detailed reports talking about, is this going to be a good place? And basically, what are we going to create here? Or how are we going to run this? He had very detailed recommendations as well for, here are the resorts we're essentially going to build. And we need to have somewhere that is different places that we're going to be for all different economical levels. So you can have some kind of a dormitory place, and then you're going to have more of a moderate resort, and then you're going to have more of a high level resort at some point. So things like that was really interesting. And then the other thing, which we talked about, that land, buying some of the land around it. So Walt just, had the foresight enough to say, okay, this is going to be smart, because then I'm going to have more of the control. If the government does pick me, then I'm going to also hold on to some of the surrounding land as well. But of course, we also see that with the Florida project, right? Because he was basically pretty upset about how things went with Disneyland. He loved Disneyland. Obviously, it's fabulous, still is to this day. But of course, as soon as people in the city of Anaheim, a lot of people, when they realized how successful Disneyland was, you kind of got some of those cheesy motels that started cropping up right around it, and gift shops and things like that. And Walt said, if this happens, I'm never going to do that again. And then so we saw that again, that same thing happen with both Mineral King and with Walt Disney World.
And speaking of things that crept into Walt Disney World, now, one of the issues with the ski resort back then was that it had a lack of evening activities appealing to various visitor segments. So, Walt went to his good old animator pal, Imagineer pal, Mark Davis, and he said, "Mark, I need an all-bear band." And if you're a Disney fan, I'm sure that rings a bell, doesn't it? An all-bear band created by Mark Davis. The story was that the bears were going to come out of the sequoias and they were trained to be entertainers at this ski resort. And of course, this eventually became the Country Bear Jamboree.
Yes, absolutely. And it's so funny. Again, I think that if you're at Walt Disney World, you're not thinking about, oh, bears make a lot of sense. Like they came out of the swamplands around here. It makes a lot more sense that, hey, we're going to be in this mountain area and we're in the woods and bears live here. So it's so funny to think about that. And so when a lot of this controversy was happening, they were in the midst of creating the Country Bear Jamboree, and also audio animatronics were becoming so important to Walt at this time, especially. Obviously, we saw it in some of the Disneyland attractions, but Walt also really was doing a really good job and thorough job with them and really investing in that technology, especially in the 1966 World's Fair. And so he thought, okay, here's another slam dunk. Let's bring that technology too, because there was also going to be, things like the People Mover, like we talked about, and other kinds of very high-tech stuff that was going to be at Mineral King. Let's also bring the Country Bear Jamboree in here. And that's also going to be this kind of high-tech, fun activity that people can see. And yeah, it made a lot of sense. But then when a lot of this controversy was happening and they weren't exactly sure, is this project going to happen? Again, after years of delays, the court case, everything like that. And then when Walt Disney World was opening in 1971, they said, all right, let's actually put this here in Walt Disney World instead, at least for the time being. And of course, there it is, still to this day.
Still going at Walt Disney World, yeah.
Still going, yeah.
All right, so the interesting thing was Disney kind of had to market this, resort that it hadn't even broken ground or anything, but they needed to market it because of such bad press. And from that, we got an 8-page brochure called The Disney Plans for Mineral King. There's a quote from Walt in this where he says, "All of us promise that our efforts now and in the future will be dedicated to making Mineral King grow to meet the ever-increasing public need. I guess you might say that it won't ever be finished." Which, Disneyland will never be finished as long as there's imagination left in the world. So once again, now we're throwing back to Disneyland instead of looking forward to Walt Disney World here. But
it's so weird how those things, it all tied so much together. I remember, again, when we were doing some of this research, and we would read things like that. And I remember kind of, if we're doing interviews or spotting it, depending where in some of the brochures and things like that, it was like, wait, was this from Mineral King? Because obviously he said this exact same thing as well to some of the other projects. So it was interesting. But that quote, now that you say that was another thing that was controversial, because then after the people who were against this and the environmentalists then basically jumped on that quote and said, wait, you just told us you're just going to keep this very modest. It's going to be nice. You're trying to temper our fears. And then here you are saying, oh, it's always going to be expanding, so they were thinking too, not just like it is in Walt Disney World where, oh, let's think about a new ride or attraction or something like that. Their fears were, oh my God, he's going to keep building. He's going to tear other things down. His footprint's going to be all over this park.
Yeah. And so kind of in response to that, so Disney had the Disney Plans for Mineral King brochure. There was something called The Optimist, which had the opposite intention, correct?
Yes. It did. And there was a lot of interesting kind of grassroots activism that was going on at this time. And the Sierra Club was part of that, but then it was also people who were just invested in the environment, whether they were in that club or not. And it was also people that were living in that area because there were a handful of cabins that did exist in that Mineral King area. And so we don't know 100% for sure, but chances are they would have been torn down at some point to make room to create the Disney resort. And so the Optimist newsletter was sent out basically as this grassroots newsletter. It was sent all over the place. Politicians were involved in it at some point. They had things like a documentary that they were touting, all this kind of stuff. And this was run by this woman named Jean Koch, who was a fantastic woman who actually spent time in Mineral King. She had a family cabin there, and she was a Sierra Club member, but she actually led a lot of that grassroots activism against the Disney resort. And she was a phenomenal person. We spoke to her several times over the years, actually, and she was 100 years old, by the way, when we spoke to her a few different times. But she did pass away at the age of 100. I am sorry to report, but had an amazing life. But she did some really crazy things against this. She would distribute this newsletter. She was responsible for funding and helping to create a documentary that basically told people all about this Disney project, why it should not be built. And she would put signs all up, and she would organize protests, including one that happened in Disneyland, on Disneyland property. And yeah, and in that newsletter, she would do all kinds of funny things. Like she would put in the names. We were able to get our hands on quite a bit of those newsletters and comb through it, which was fun. But she had put in the names and addresses of a bunch of different people, including politicians and also Disney executives like Card Walker, who was Disney president at the time, not long after Walt had passed away. But she said, like, everyone write letters to Card Walker and tell him you don't want this here. So it was pretty funny.
Well, that's a perfect segue, because I was going to mention Disney president Card Walker, years after Walt's passing. This would have been 1972. He ended up taking out these newspaper ads to basically talk directly to the citizens of California, because he was frustrated that there was this message that was kind of misconstruing what Walt was going for. And this comes directly from your book. So, Card Walker said in that ad, "No one seems to remember what Walt Disney really had in mind at Mineral King. What Walt Disney said was simply this: the creation of recreational services at Mineral King is a challenge and an obligation. A challenge to serve the growing public need, an obligation to serve the beauty of the land. I remember because I was there with Walt Disney, and I'm tired of hearing and reading the distortions, the misinformation, the lawsuits, and all the press releases vilifying the concepts proposed by Walt Disney and Walt Disney Productions." So once again, Card Walker was a person who knew Walt. This wasn't a company brand name. This was an attack on a colleague and a friend of his. So it sounds like he kind of took it quite personally.
Yes, absolutely. That was one of my favorite parts of the book, I think, that we had found out in the research, just because I'm just imagining Bob Iger or something, like putting out these these like full page newspaper ads, just tearing people apart. It was funny in a way that he handled it like that. And I loved it, to be honest. He was such an interesting guy. And one of the interesting things about this was that Walt Disney, again, we talked about how much he wanted this. I would almost make the argument he almost wanted this ski resort more than he wanted a lot of different things that he had done in his, very, very, very storied career. He cared about this so much. But a lot of people, when he came up with this thought, a lot of people in the Disney company, including Roy Disney, said, okay, I guess, essentially.
That sounds
Do we
familiar,
really
though.
want to do this? Yeah, exactly. Like, hey, we're in the movie business. Okay, now we're in the theme park business. What is this? Why do we want to do this? But Card Walker was the guy that was backing Walt this whole time. And so when he says in that newspaper ad, I was there with Walt Disney, I know what he wanted, he's talking about he was actually there in like 1965, 1966, visiting Mineral Cane area. And he was at those press conferences, for instance, that was happening when Walt was announcing this. And he was walking around that area, seeing how excited Walt was about this. And so Card Walker basically had this become one of his personal missions was I want to do things. And I think people with, a pretty good knowledge of Disney history know that that Card Walker was a big proponent of Walt Disney, a good friend. And a lot of what he tried to do in those years when he was leading the Disney company was a lot of things that, he kind of had in his head. What would Walt do? And that was what kind of drove him. But a lot of this was all about this Mineral King Resort. He wanted this to happen for Walt because this was one of the last things that he was working on, obviously, at the time of his death. So he really, really wanted this to happen. So at that time of that newspaper ad, he was seeing, some of the legal stuff come up. He was seeing them be protested constantly. He was seeing newspaper articles and editorials saying, I can't believe you're marring this land, and essentially putting out, more or less lies about what Disney wanted, because, a lot of people were saying, oh, they're just grabbing at money. And obviously Card said, nope, that's not what Walt wanted.
Yeah, and as you said, Roy had his reservations. So Roy very much, the dream that Roy was working on making become a reality was Walt Disney World, and Card Walker was working on Mineral King. Mm-hmm. And Roy especially had his reservations with Mineral King because he was worried it was going to tarnish the Disney brand name, considering all of the protesting. And as you mentioned, the March on Disneyland, where there were literally picketers, which I guess isn't that uncommon, but you know, still probably perhaps the first time that happened in the park's history.
Yeah, exactly. And there was also another kind of famous to this case, but there was another protest that happened at one of the Disney shareholder meetings too. And so shareholders they had some big meeting with, all the stock owners and just talking about all the successes and how Disney was doing. And then meanwhile, outside, there was a bunch of protesters saying, what are you doing? And so then that meeting actually then later became to concerned shareholders say, are you sure you want to do this? Like this isn't looking good. So the things were starting to certainly make a difference.
It did get all the way to the point where in 1968, the Disney plan did officially get approved by the Forest Service. It was definitely compromise, right? It wasn't as grand as the original intent. Here's what it says in your book. In estimates that had been scaled down slightly from Disney's original 1965 proposal, the company projected some 5,000 skiers per day when the resort opened in 1973, the number climbing to 8,500 by 1978. Mineral King would be one of the few ski areas in the country offering uninterrupted ski runs as long as 4 miles, with a vertical drop of more than 3,700 feet. Food service facilities were planned for the 2 major lift terminals, and the bowls would be linked via interconnecting trails. Visitors would park in an 8-story underground garage located outside the valley, from which day skiers would be whisked by gondolas to the slopes, while overnight guests would take a relaxing ride on a cog railroad a little over a mile to reach the Alpine Village, where their luggage and skis would be waiting for them in their rooms. Okay, Disney Magical Express, luggage and skis already in the rooms? Hello. The village area was slated to include 465 guest rooms, a mix of hotel, apartment, and dorm-style accommodations, as well as 5 restaurants, a convention center, theater, railroad station, pet lodge, and specialty shops. 20 acres near the village would be developed for snow play activities, including sledding and ice skating, waiting, and the summertime, which noted would be just as busy, if not more so. Then the winter months, the area would be home to volleyball, shuffleboard, and badminton courts, horseback riding, and a heated outdoor pool. So it was much more than skiing, that's for sure. And
Yes.
that was approved, right? Like that was approved by the Forest Service. And they never, ever even broke ground, correct?
No, never, nothing was ever started to get built. It was just, I mean, it was a ton of planning. There were a lot of the models that graced the Disney sound stages and things like that. There were tons of different reports. They obviously started and completed the Country Bear Jamboree. I mean, they were ready to go. They were really, really excited about this. And this essentially, more or less, the story starts in 1960 and it officially ends in 1978. So
Wow.
it's an incredibly long chunk of time. This is not, and like you said, you assumed at some point that probably, oh, Walt dies, that's kind of the end of it. And I think that's a lot of people, that's what they, if they're familiar with Mineral King, that's kind of the misconception. And that's not what happened. It is really mind-boggling that this story is as long as it is.
Yeah, and there are a couple of big things that happened that really, really killed the projects. First of all, President Carter killed the project when he made Mineral King part of Sequoia National Park and safe from major development. He signed something that basically made that law, and at that point, it's dead.
Yeah, that was the final nail. Mm-hmm.
That was the final nail in the coffin. But one thing that was kind of interesting and tragic was, as we mentioned, tons of research went into this, and they did studies about avalanches and the likelihood. And they're like, no, we found a safe space. And unfortunately, that was not true. There was a major avalanche.
Yes, there was. When they were doing a lot of this planning, though no ground was broken, they had a lot of different snow studies and soil studies. Again, they were very good about trying to preserve the area and make sure everything was good, but which could not be worse timing. At some point, they had some people there and they were looking at the snow and things like that. And there's Disney employee, and then there were people hired by Disney. And essentially, when they were there trying to figure out some stuff, they were staying in that area, and an avalanche happened, and someone actually died during that avalanche, who was there trying to figure out things for Disney. And so that was another thing that people kind of jumped on, saying, you said this was a safe area, when in fact this kind of stuff obviously has the potential of happening. I mean, we still hear about this obviously with ski resorts nowadays, but it was just a very sad event, and obviously very unfortunate. I mean, on the Disney side, just because that was just one more thing that certainly worked against them.
Yeah, and it does seem that all of these protests and everything they had to go through with this, they took it, they learned from it. They ended up putting a conservation plan in place for Walt Disney World. So even though Mineral King wasn't moving forward, they're like, let's take these lessons and learn from them. So there's the conservation plan at Walt Disney World. Something I found interesting reading this was about, the inspiration you can find in a lot of different places, and we'll go through some of them in a moment. But I want to talk about Aulani, because Aulani, which isn't that old, what was it, 2011, I believe it opened? It was the first Disney property to be inspired by its natural surroundings and embrace true cultural authenticity, which is what they were trying to do with Mineral King. And it took, what did you say, it died in 1978, essentially, until 2011 to make that goal a reality. Kind of unbelievable.
Yeah. And so I don't know if you've been there. We have been there before. And when we were writing it, we had gone there. And then at that moment, I was like, wait a minute. Like, I see what they were trying to do. And again, in that research that we had conducted for the book, we saw that Disney was, because when it was announced, oh, Disney's going to build this Hawaiian resort. And of course, there's a lot of excitement, but then there was on the flip side of that, just like with Mineral Cane, a lot of people were not happy about it because, oh, you're coming in here, you're going to take our land, you're going to, make this, you're going to bring Mickey in, and what is this really going to look like?
Man, Mickey gets such a bad rap sometimes.
I know.
What do people have against Mickey?
I know. I want to see a Mickey in different places. But so people were kind of upset about it. And so what Disney did was they did something that, to my knowledge, they didn't do before, which was they basically formed a committee and had people from the Hawaiian culture and basically said, like, how can we represent you? How could we bring in the surroundings instead of let's make, the Grand Floridian, the contemporary and New Orleans style and whatever they do, for instance, at Walt Disney World, and everything's just kind of in there and you figure it out later. But that Aulani was so much about, let's celebrate the culture. Let's have it be all Hawaiian and really kind of, what the islands are really about. And so I think they did a really beautiful job with that. And it's also because of, I think it was a big learning thing from Mineral Cane, because instead of, yes, they were talking to people at Mineral Cane and they wanted to create it and make it more of, that's going to be kind of the area. But they certainly did that in a very intentional way in Hawaii. And it seems like it has to have to do with part of that controversy that they did experience, of course, decades earlier.
And Mineral King has some fun little Easter eggs in Disney properties. I got to talk about the Carousel of Progress, because Walt Disney's Carousel of Progress is my go-to must-do attraction when I'm at Magic Kingdom. I love it.
Fantastic. It's the best. I agree.
And they recently updated it with a little Mineral King Easter egg, if you want to share that.
Yes. And I had seen it first, not in person, of course, just, blogs and stuff that had mentioned it. And I think my mouth like literally opened once we saw some of this. But they have the sun in the final scene, in the future scene. Of course, listeners can't see me using my
air quotes
on the future scene here. But he has a t-shirt on, and it basically has the Sky Crown logo and this mountain, and it has a sun. And this was a logo that they had developed, again, even though no ground was broken, that was going to be at the featured restaurant at Mineral King. And it's in the Carousel of Progress, which is just fabulous.
Yeah, so it's on the Sun sweatshirt, and I think people have recreated it for Etsy shops and stuff, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah.
So that's a deep cut. I love that.
It really is. It feels like in recent years, the Imagineers seem to have a little more fun with it and seeing them kind of bring it, because for so many years, I feel like we didn't hear anything about Mineral Cane at all. This was not something that Disney has really been open about.
Yeah, the first time I think I ever heard about it at all was when looking into some Country Bear Jamboree history and hearing about it being developed initially for the ski resort. And I was like, what's this? And then went a little deeper into it. But oh my gosh, there's so much more to the story than I ever realized that I just recently learned reading your book.
Yeah.
Can you touch on the wonderful Winter of Mickey Mouse and how that kind of paid a little homage to it?
Yes. In one of the new Mickey shorts, which are so fun, by the way, I really love them. But again, I was just watching it, no concept of this. And Mickey and Donald and Goofy and pals decide to go skiing. And they are driving up, and there's a big sign, and it says Mineral King. And they have a brochure, says Mineral King as well. And it's just, the whole thing is all about Mineral King, which is just crazy. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, very cool. Folks, the book is Disneyland on the Mountain, Walt, the Environmentalists, and the Ski Resort That Never Was, by today's guest, Kathryn Mayer, and her writing partner, Greg Glasgow. Where can folks find the book, and anything else you want to add before we get going here?
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for the time. This is so fun, especially talking to Disney people about the book for sure. But the book is available on really anywhere that you imagine books are sold, especially online, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and the like. And we do have a website. And it's DisneylandOnTheMountain.com. And that's where you can find a lot of our information. If you want to reach out to us, we'd love to hear from you. And that's also where you can find links to buy the book and any kind of upcoming events and things like that. So feel free to reach out.
Excellent. Any future Disney books you're working on currently, or maybe just marinating in the brain?
Yes, there is certainly some marination going on. So nothing official that can be announced yet, but definitely are starting to work on the next project. So fingers crossed on that.
Awesome. Well, Kathryn, thank you so much. This was a really great conversation and a very, very interesting read.
Yes, thank you, Jeff, so much.
Thanks for tuning into this episode. Don't miss any future episodes by subscribing and following Disney with a Z, coast to coast on your favorite podcast app, where episodes are available 24/7. If you're a longtime listener of the show, thank you. And if you have the means, consider supporting the show over on Patreon. By joining Disney Coast to Coast's Patreon membership, you'll gain access to extra bonuses, including live stream Ask Me Anythings, unreleased episodes, and more bonus content. Take a look at all that's available by clicking the Patreon link in this episode's description, and thank you for considering. And thanks to Lil Silerman for leaving a 5-star rating and review saying, "By far my favorite Disney podcast. I always make sure to check back every Wednesday to get the latest updates on all things Disney, and I'm never disappointed." Leave a review wherever you listen to the podcast, and you may just hear it read on a future episode. Until next time, anything you need can be found in this episode's description. From additional information and links discussed in this episode found in the show notes, to the DCTC hotline where you can leave a voicemail and be heard on a future episode, contact info to reach me, access to the show's official website, some free gifts from me to you, and so much more. So be sure to check out this episode's description. Other than that, folks, have a magical day. Bye!